Everyone knows South Korea as the land of K-pop, cutting-edge technology, and the dramas that have conquered the world. But what few people know is that behind this shine, there is a dark and alarming reality. While the lights of Seoul illuminate skyscrapers and luxurious neighborhoods like Gangnam, thousands of people live in precarious conditions, facing extreme poverty, and a system that seems to have forgotten the most vulnerable. Elderly people without government support are forced into unimaginable choices, such as resorting to prostitution to survive. The youth, burdened by a society obsessed with success, are giving up on marriage, having children, or even dreaming of a stable future. And in the heart of the big cities, the Banjiha, the famous basements shown in the film Parasite, house entire families in unsanitary and cramped spaces. In this video, we will explore the dark side of South Korea. While the country stands out globally, many face a constant struggle for work, housing, and dignity. Is this the South Korean dream they envisioned? South Korea is located on the Korean peninsula, next to North Korea and close to Japan and China, strategically connecting these regions. With a population of approximately 52 million people, the country has a high population density, concentrated in major urban centers like Seoul, while 70% of its territory is mountainous, limiting habitable and agricultural areas. The history of South Korea is a true saga of challenges, achievements, and transformations. The saga begins in the early 20th century, when the Korean peninsula fell under Japanese rule. This brutal occupation was a dark period for the Korean people. The country's natural and cultural wealth was exploited to the extreme. Land was confiscated, resources drained, and Korean culture, including the use of the language, was severely repressed. Men were forced into slave labor in Japanese factories, while women, many of them teenagers, were subjected to the horror of serving as comfort women for the Japanese army. This trauma deeply marked the identity of the Korean people and shaped the spirit of resistance that would become crucial in the following years. After liberation in 1945, the relief was brief. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, divided the country into two ideological blocs, the North aligned with communism and the South under capitalist influence. Seoul, the South Korean capital, was destroyed and rebuilt several times during the conflict, and poverty reached catastrophic levels. When the war ended in a ceasefire, South Korea was in ruins, without infrastructure, resources, or sufficient support to recover. And that's when the real miracle begins. Under the leadership of determined leaders and aggressive economic policies, South Korea transformed into one of the economies that would define the term Asian tigers in the 1960s and 1970s. The strategy was clear: invest heavily in industrialization, embrace international trade, and bet on education and innovation. Companies like Samsung and Hyundai emerged in this scenario, not only as economic pillars but also as symbols of the Korean Renaissance. Samsung, which began as a small food exporter, reinvented itself and became the largest electronics manufacturer in the world. Hyundai not only put Korea on the automotive map but also helped rebuild the country's infrastructure with its massive construction and engineering operations. South Korea faces one of the greatest challenges in its recent history, a demographic crisis that threatens its social and economic stability. And it all begins with a number that is both impressive and concerning: the life expectancy of South Koreans, which may reach the unprecedented mark of 90 years by 2030. While this longevity reflects advances in public health and quality of life, it also exposes the country to accelerated population aging. Today, South Korea has one of the fastest aging populations in the world, with elderly people making up an increasingly larger portion of society. This raises an inevitable question: who will sustain the next generation of retirees? The answer is worrying. South Korea also has the lowest birth rate on the planet, with an average of less than 0.8 children per woman, a number far below what is needed to maintain a stable population. The reasons behind this low birth rate are complex. The intense work culture, for example, is one of the main culprits. Long and demanding work days, combined with stagnant wages, leave little room for personal life. Young people who grow up under this pressure often hesitate to make commitments like marriage and children, prioritizing career and personal development. Another factor is the high cost of living. Living in major urban centers like Seoul has become almost prohibitive for many families. Housing, education, and childcare are expenses that intimidate even the most optimistic. For many, starting a family simply does not seem viable. And it's not just an economic issue. Social expectations also play a significant role. The intense competition for academic and professional excellence, rooted in Korean culture, creates an environment where young people feel they have neither the time. Another problem challenging South Korean society is gender inequality, an issue deeply rooted in the country's culture and social structures. In response to this scenario, the 4B movement emerged, led by women who decided to reject marriage, children, relationships, and even sexual relations. This stance is not just an act of resistance, resistance but a way of seeking freedom in a society that still carries strong patriarchal traits and suffocating cultural pressures. The impact of this movement is significant and reflects a generational change. Today, 65% of women in South Korea say they have no interest in marrying or having children. This statistic did not emerge out of nowhere. Domestic violence, wage inequality, and the double shift faced by many women trying to balance career and family are factors that fuel this decision. Additionally, the expectation that women abandon their professional ambitions for family life remains a widely accepted reality, though it is increasingly contested. Resistance to the patriarchal system is also linked to the conditions of the labor market. Despite being one of the most academically qualified female populations in the world, Korean women face difficulties in reaching leadership positions. Many are discouraged from pursuing their goals due to the macho culture present both in the corporate environment and in everyday life. This scenario has consequences that go beyond social issues. South Korea's birth rate is one of the lowest in the world, and the 4B movement exacerbates this demographic challenge. With a rapidly aging population and a generation of young people increasingly disillusioned with the traditional life model, the country faces unprecedented economic and social pressures. Now let's talk about a lesser-known side of South Korea: poverty. About 16% of the South Korean population lives in poverty. And for many, this means living in the so-called banjiha, the underground houses that became globally known after the success of the movie Parasite. Banjiha are small, semi-subterranean apartments, originally built as shelters against attacks during the Cold War. Today, however, they represent an affordable alternative for those who cannot afford the high housing costs in the country. These spaces, although cheaper, come at a high cost in terms of quality of life. The conditions are alarming: poor ventilation, scarce lighting, recurring issues with humidity and mold, and the constant risk of flooding. During the heavy rains that hit Seoul in 2022, several families living in these places were trapped or lost their homes. But the precariousness doesn't stop there. Many residents face problems with pest infestations, which make life in these environments even more difficult. Privacy is also limited, with windows often facing directly onto the street, exposing residents to noise and external pollution. What further exacerbates this situation is the evident contrast between the luxury of the upper classes and the reality faced by these residents. While the South Korean economy is often praised for its technological innovation and rapid industrialization, the growth has not benefited all segments of the population equally. Many low-income workers face long hours and insufficient wages, which keeps them trapped in a cycle of poverty. Despite the visibility brought by Parasite and government efforts to improve living conditions, the problem is far from resolved. Housing programs have been implemented to provide alternatives to the banjiha, but the demand for affordable housing still exceeds the supply. Additionally, the high cost of living in cities like Seoul makes it almost impossible for many families to ascend socially. One of the most alarming problems faced by South Korean society is related to the elderly. Despite the country's economic and technological advancements, this vulnerable segment of the population lives a reality of abandonment, poverty, and despair. The numbers reveal a silent crisis. Approximately half of the elderly in South Korea live below the poverty line, facing extreme difficulties in meeting even the most basic needs. This situation is exacerbated by an insufficient pension system. Many elderly people rely solely on pensions that cannot cover costs like food, housing, and medical care. To make matters worse, the traditional family structure, where children cared for their parents in old age, is disappearing rapidly. The result is that thousands of elderly people find themselves without financial or emotional support. Furthermore, South Korea has one of the highest suicide rates in the world, with the elderly being one of the most affected groups. For many, social pressure combined with isolation and lack of prospects becomes unbearable. It's a tragedy that goes beyond the numbers. These are stories of lives forgotten by society. One of the most shocking consequences of this scenario is prostitution among elderly women. Known as Bacchus ladies, this phenomenon involves elderly women who, due to lack of alternatives, sell energy drinks as a pretext to offer sexual services. It's a cruel reality, where women who should be living with dignity resort to this type of activity to survive. While the rest of the world views South Korea as a model of progress, this problem reminds us that behind all the modernity's shine, there are shadows that need to be illuminated. This is an issue that cannot continue to be ignored and demands immediate solutions to restore dignity and hope to the country's elderly. Slums may not be the first thing that comes to mind when thinking about South Korea, but they do exist, even in a country that boasts the 14th largest economy in the world. Among these areas, places like Gamcheon and the precarious settlements in Gangnam stand out, revealing two very different sides of this reality. Gamcheon, located in Busan, was once an extremely poor area. Known as the colored slum, it underwent an impressive transformation. In the 2000s, the local government started a revitalization project that painted the houses in vibrant colors and promoted tourism in the area. Today, Gamcheon is known as a cultural village, attracting visitors from around the world who walk through its narrow alleys and admire the art spread throughout the neighborhood. Despite its new appearance, the historical roots of poverty and marginalization are still evident to those who look closely. On the other hand, settlements in Gangnam, the wealthiest and most sophisticated district of Seoul, show a glaring contrast. Amid luxury skyscrapers and high-end stores, there are areas like Goryeo Village, an informal settlement where living conditions are extremely poor. Without proper access to basic sanitation or infrastructure, residents face harsh winters and suffocating summers in makeshift shelters. Many of these urban slums emerged due to forced evictions. During preparations for the Seoul 1988 Olympics, thousands of people were removed from their homes to make way for new buildings and infrastructure. Without viable alternatives, many ended up creating makeshift settlements. This legacy of removals still impacts communities struggling to keep a roof over their heads in a country where the cost of living is extremely high. South Korea is a clear example of how economic growth doesn't always mean full social progress. The country has achieved impressive development, becoming one of the world's largest economies and a global hub for technology, culture, and innovation. However, behind this success, there are deeply rooted social problems that continue to challenge its society. Issues like persistent poverty, structural sexism, and growing inequality reveal the limits of this progress. While some areas thrive with wealth and modernity, others face precarious living conditions, demonstrating the disparity between the classes. Moreover, an aging and disillusioned population reflects the impact of a system that demands a high price for success but offers little support to the most vulnerable. These structural challenges are not only internal problems but also lessons for the world. They show that, even with great advances, it's essential to balance economic growth with social policies that ensure quality of life for all. South Korea, like other countries, faces the dilemma of reconciling its achievements with a reality that still needs attention and profound changes. The country's future will depend on how it chooses to address these issues. And the video ends here. Which of these secrets did you find most surprising? Please share your thoughts about the darker side of South Korea in the comments section. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like. Your support means a lot to us. Click the video that is appearing on your screen right now. I'm sure you'll like the content. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.